The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was a time of significant social, economic, and cultural change across Europe. One aspect of daily life that dramatically reflected these changes was the diet and food consumption patterns of medieval people. Unlike the modern era where food is abundant and diverse, medieval food was heavily dependent on geography, social status, season, and agricultural capabilities. Understanding what medieval people ate provides fascinating insights into their lives, their values, and their struggle for survival. The food people consumed was not merely sustenance. It was deeply connected to their social position, religious beliefs, and the technological limitations of the age. The study of medieval diet has become increasingly important for historians because it reveals the harsh realities of medieval life. Food scarcity, malnutrition, and food-related diseases were common problems that affected populations across Europe. However, the wealthy and noble classes enjoyed far more variety and abundance than peasants and common folk. This division in diet reflected and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of medieval society. Religion also played a crucial role in determining what people ate, particularly the Christian practice of fasting and abstinence on certain days of the week and during religious periods like Lent. The availability of food changed dramatically between seasons, which meant that medieval people had to develop sophisticated methods of food preservation. Salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation were not just cooking techniques, but essential survival skills. Storage of food for winter months determined whether families and communities would survive the cold season or face starvation. The organization of food production, distribution, and consumption was intertwined with feudalism, where lords controlled agricultural lands and peasants worked the fields in exchange for protection and a portion of the harvest. Archaeological evidence, written records from monasteries and noble households, and historical documents have provided us with detailed information about medieval dietary practices. Kitchen accounts from royal courts, monastic records, and merchant documents reveal what people actually ate. These sources show that medieval cuisine was far more varied and sophisticated than popular stereotypes suggest. While bread certainly formed the backbone of the medieval diet, medieval people consumed a remarkable variety of foods, including vegetables, fruits, meats, fish, dairy products, and grains, though availability varied greatly by season and social status. The medieval approach to food was also heavily influenced by the theory of humors, a medical belief inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine. Food was classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and dietary choices were sometimes made based on the belief that they would balance the four humors in the body and maintain good health. This ancient medical theory influenced not only what people ate, but how they prepared their food and combined different ingredients in their dishes. Bread was undoubtedly the most important and fundamental food in medieval Europe. For the vast majority of the population, bread constituted between 50 and 70% of their total caloric intake. The type of bread consumed varied significantly based on social class and economic circumstances. Nobles and wealthy merchants enjoyed bread made from wheat flour, which was white and considered a luxury item. The middle classes might eat bread made from barley or rye, while the poorest peasants often consumed dark bread made from coarse grains, or even beans mixed with grain to stretch the flour. Further, the production of bread was a centralized activity in most medieval communities. Local lords typically owned the village oven, and residents had to pay fees to use it for baking their bread. This system, called banalité or seigneurial monopoly, was one of the ways lords extracted wealth and control from their peasant subjects. The quality of bread varied depending on the harvest and available grains. In years of poor harvests, bread became harder to come by. sometimes forcing people to make bread from inferior grains, chestnuts, acorns, or even tree bark and grass seeds during times of extreme famine. Grains beyond wheat were crucial to medieval survival. Barley, rye, oats, and millet were grown extensively across Europe and provided carbohydrates to sustain the population. These grains were made into porridges, gruels, and various grain-based dishes in addition to bread. Oats were particularly important in Northern Europe and were often considered peasant food, though they provided essential nutrition. Millet and other coarse grains were common in Eastern Europe and Mediterranean regions. The preparation of grains often involved boiling them with water to create thick, warming dishes that could feed entire families. Legumes, including beans, lentils, and peas, were another cornerstone of the medieval diet, particularly for the poor and during times of meat scarcity. Dried peas and beans could be stored through winter and provided protein that complemented grain-based diets. Split pea soup was a common dish throughout medieval Europe, particularly in the winter months. These legumes were boiled with herbs and sometimes meat bones to create filling, nutritious soups that could warm people during cold weather. The ability to grow, harvest, and store legumes made them invaluable to medieval communities, and they were sometimes called poor man's meat, because they provided protein without the expense of raising livestock. Vegetables formed an important part of the medieval diet, though the variety available changed dramatically with the seasons. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, onions, and garlic could be stored through winter, and were staple components of winter diets. Cabbages, brassicas, and other leafy greens were grown in vegetable gardens. Medieval people ate more vegetables than popular culture suggests, though the wealthy enjoyed greater variety. Summer brought fresh produce, including peas, beans, cucumbers, and various herbs. Medieval gardens, whether belonging to nobles or peasants, were carefully planned to provide year-round nutrition. Onions and garlic were particularly important vegetables that were used for flavoring as well as food. They could be dried and stored for winter use and were believed to have medicinal properties. Mushrooms, both cultivated and wild, were gathered seasonally and added nutritional variety to diets. Wild fruits like berries, cherries, and apples were gathered when in season and preserved through drying or by making into compounds and pastes. Apples and pears could be stored through much of winter if kept in cool places, making them valuable sources of vitamins during months when fresh produce was scarce. Meat consumption was perhaps the most visible marker of social status in medieval society. Wealthy nobles consumed meat regularly, often in large quantities, and hunting rights were privileges reserved for the nobility. Peasants, in contrast, rarely ate meat except during festivals or after the slaughter of animals in autumn, when feed for livestock became scarce. The type of meat one consumed also indicated social status. Beef and venison were considered noble meats, while pork was more common among middle classes, and chicken was eaten across various social levels. Though more frequently by the wealthy, pork was extremely important to medieval diet, particularly for the common people. Pigs were raised across Europe because they could be fed on scraps and required less space than cattle. Every part of the pig was utilized. The meat was eaten fresh or preserved through salting and smoking. Bones were used for broth, and intestines became casings for sausages. Autumn pig slaughter provided meat that could be preserved through salting and smoking to provide protein for winter months. The importance of pork in medieval diet cannot be overstated, as it was often the primary source of animal protein for peasants. Beef required significant resources to produce, as cattle needed substantial pasture and feed. Therefore, beef was primarily consumed by those wealthy enough to maintain herds of cattle. Noble feasts featured beef prominently, and the consumption of beef was a clear demonstration of wealth and status. Cattle were also valuable as draft animals for plowing fields, So using them for meat was an economic decision made mainly when animals became old or by the wealthy who could afford to raise animals specifically for consumption. Venison and game hunting represented the highest levels of luxury and were restricted by law in most medieval societies. Hunting rights were carefully controlled by kings and nobles, and unauthorized hunting could result in severe punishment. Royal forests were preserved as hunting grounds exclusively for the nobility, and the privilege of hunting was a symbol of aristocratic status. Venison was served at grand feasts and was considered one of the finest foods available. Wild boar, hare, rabbit, and various game birds were also hunted when available, and reserved primarily for noble tables. Chicken and other domestic birds were raised throughout medieval society, though more commonly by the wealthy. Eggs from chickens, ducks, and geese provided valuable protein and were often used in cooking and baking. Eggs were eaten throughout the year and could be preserved through various methods. Geese and ducks were fattened before slaughter and their meat was considered particularly flavorful. Wild birds, including thrushes, larks, and other small birds, were sometimes trapped or hunted and roasted for consumption, particularly by the wealthy. Fish and seafood formed an important part of the medieval diet, especially in coastal regions and for the Catholic clergy during fasting periods. Monastic communities, which were significant food producers and consumers, relied heavily on fish as a meat substitute during religious fasting days that comprised nearly half the calendar year. Saltwater fish like herring, cod, and mackerel were salted and dried, allowing them to be transported inland and stored for long periods. Fresh fish from rivers was consumed in areas near waterways, though transportation difficulties meant that most people inland consumed only dried or salted fish. Shellfish and other seafood were available in coastal regions and were consumed in varying quantities depending on location. Oysters, mussels, and other shellfish were eaten by both rich and poor in coastal areas, though the wealthy enjoyed them more frequently. The preservation of fish through salting and drying was an ancient practice continued throughout the medieval period, and preserved fish became an important trade commodity. Fishing rights were carefully regulated, often controlled by feudal lords who could charge fees to those who wished to fish in rivers and streams on their lands. Cheese was one of the most important foods in medieval Europe, providing concentrated nutrition and protein that could be stored for extended periods. Cheese making was a well-established practice throughout the medieval period, with specific regions developing distinctive cheese varieties. The production of cheese allowed milk, which was highly perishable, to be preserved in a form that could last through winter. Monastic communities became particularly renowned for cheese making, with monks developing many of the classic European cheeses that are still produced today. The type of cheese available varied by region and season. Fresh cheese made from milk could be eaten within days of production, while harder cheeses aged over months or years provided long-term storage of nutritional value. Wealthy people enjoyed a variety of cheeses, while peasants typically produced simpler varieties from their own limited milk supply. The production of cheese required significant quantities of milk, so only those who maintained herds of goats, sheep, or cattle could produce cheese regularly. Most medieval peasants owned only a few animals, limiting their cheese production to small quantities for personal consumption. Milk itself was consumed less frequently in medieval times than in the modern era, as pasteurization had not yet been invented and milk could quickly become unsafe. However, milk was used in cooking, and was sometimes added to grains and vegetables to create more nutritious dishes. Fresh milk was primarily consumed by those who owned dairy animals, as milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. The poor often drank weak beer or other beverages instead of milk, though those with access to fresh milk from their animals would have consumed some fresh milk in summer months. Butter was another important dairy product that was made from cream through churning. Butter could be salted to preserve it and stored in cool places for extended periods. The production of butter was labor-intensive, and it was primarily produced by those with significant dairy herds or by monastic communities. Butter was used in cooking among the wealthy, but was less accessible to the poor, who might use animal fats or rendered lard for cooking instead. Curds and whey, the byproducts of cheesemaking, were eaten as food in their own right. Curds could be eaten fresh with bread or combined with other ingredients in dishes. The whey was sometimes used in cooking or fed to animals. Every part of the cheesemaking process was utilized to minimize waste and maximize nutrition. Sour milk or milk that had begun to spoil could sometimes be transformed into whey or used in cooking, where the acidic properties were beneficial. Medieval life was fundamentally shaped by the seasons and the availability of food that changed throughout the year. Spring brought fresh vegetables and dairy products as animals produced milk after giving birth. Summer was the season of greatest abundance, with fresh fruits, vegetables, and greens available. Autumn was a time of intense harvest and preparation for winter, with preservation of food being critical for survival. Winter was the season of scarcity, when people relied on preserved foods and stored crops. The transition from autumn to winter was marked by the slaughter of animals that could not be fed through winter. This event, called Martinmas slaughter in many regions after the Feast of St. Martin in November, provided fresh meat that was immediately consumed or quickly preserved. The availability of fresh meat at this time meant that autumn diets included meat that would not be available again until the following autumn for most peasants. This cycle of abundance followed by scarcity shaped the rhythm of medieval life and agricultural practices. Salting was one of the most important food preservation techniques in medieval times. Salt was a valuable and sometimes expensive commodity, and salted foods were significant trade goods. Fish were heavily salted to preserve them for long journeys and extended storage. Pork was salt-cured to make products like bacon and salt pork that could be stored for months. The consumption of salty foods was therefore not simply a matter of taste preference, but a consequence of the preservation methods available. Smoking of food, particularly meat and fish, was another critical preservation technique. Smoking imparted flavor while preserving food through the antimicrobial properties of smoke. Sausages made from pork were often smoked and could be stored for extended periods. Smoked fish was a staple in many regions. The construction of smokehouses was an important part of settlement infrastructure, and the smoking process required knowledge and skill to be done properly. Drying of foods was widely practiced, particularly for fruits, vegetables, and herbs. Apples were dried in autumn and eaten throughout winter. Peas and beans were left on the plant to dry before harvest. Mushrooms and other vegetables were dried in the sun or near fires. Dried foods provided nutrition during winter months but required careful protection from moisture and pests. The storage of dried foods in appropriate containers was essential to prevent spoilage. Fermentation techniques were used to preserve vegetables, particularly cabbage and other brassicas. Sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables provided both nutrition and probiotics that supported digestive health. Fermentation also created flavorful foods that made monotonous winter diets more palatable. The natural fermentation process required knowledge of proper salting and storage conditions, which was passed down through generations. Pickling and preserving in vinegar was used for various vegetables and sometimes for meat and fish. The acidic environment of vinegar prevented spoilage and allowed foods to be stored in liquid that provided additional flavor. Pickled vegetables and fruits were luxury items more common in wealthy households, but were produced by common people when vinegar was available. Storage in cool places was essential for foods like root vegetables, apples, and other produce that could remain fresh for months when kept at appropriate temperatures. Medieval people built specialized storage structures, including root cellars and cool rooms in fortified buildings, to maintain cool temperatures through much of the year. These storage facilities were crucial for survival through winter. Spices held an extraordinarily important place in medieval cuisine and economy. Expensive spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger were imported from Asia, and were so valuable that they were sometimes used as currency or gifts between nobles. The spice trade was one of the driving forces of medieval commerce and exploration, as European demand for exotic spices continuously increased. For the wealthy, spices were not merely flavorings but status symbols that demonstrated wealth and power. Pepper was the most commonly used and most expensive spice in medieval cuisine. It was imported in large quantities by wealthy households and used generously in cooking. Black pepper, which is simply the dried fruit of the pepper vine, was ground and added to meat, vegetables, and sauces. The dominance of pepper in medieval cuisine is evident from the number of pepper-based sauces documented in medieval recipe collections. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were other highly valued spices that came from the East Indies and commanded very high prices. These warm, aromatic spices were used in both sweet and savory dishes. The medieval perception of these spices was that they were heating in nature and could aid digestion. Ginger, both fresh and dried, was imported from tropical regions and was used in cooking and medicine. Saffron, the dried stigmas of the crocus flower, was rare and extremely expensive, making it a spice reserved for the tables of kings and the wealthiest nobles. For those who could not afford imported spices, local herbs provided flavoring for food. Parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, and other herbs grew in medieval gardens and were dried for use through winter. These herbs provided flavoring without the expense of imported spices, and had the added benefit of being believed to have medicinal properties. Medieval cooks used herbs with an imagination and generosity that might surprise modern palates, combining many herbs in single dishes. Mustard was an important condiment that was produced locally in many regions. Mustard seeds were ground and mixed with vinegar and spices to create a condiment that accompanied meats. Mustard was affordable and provided sharp flavor to complement rich meat dishes. Garlic and onions, which could be grown locally, provided essential flavoring and were staples in medieval cooking. The medieval theory of humors influenced the choice of spices and herbs used in cooking. Hot spices like pepper and ginger were believed to warm the body and aid digestion. Cold spices like sorrel were used to balance hot foods. Cooks attempted to create balanced dishes that would maintain the balance of humors and promote health. This connection between food and medicine was very much a part of medieval understanding of nutrition. Water was not considered safe to drink in many medieval towns and cities, as water sources were often contaminated with waste from humans and animals. Consequently, people of all ages, including children, consumed beer and wine as their primary beverages. This widespread consumption of alcoholic beverages was not necessarily a sign of rampant alcoholism, but rather a practical solution to the lack of safe drinking water. Beer was the most common beverage for ordinary people throughout much of medieval Europe, particularly in northern regions where grapes did not grow well. Beer was produced locally and was weaker than modern beer, with low alcohol content that made it safer than water, but did not cause significant intoxication when consumed in moderate quantities. Monastic communities were major brewers of beer, and monastic brewing improved the quality and consistency of beer production. The brewing process itself was a form of sanitation, as the heating of water and the addition of hops killed pathogens. Wine was the beverage of choice for the wealthy and the clergy. Vineyards were established throughout medieval Europe, with the regions best suited for wine production becoming centers of wine trade. French wines, particularly those from Bordeaux and Burgundy, became highly valued luxury commodities. The Church's use of wine in religious ceremonies created consistent demand for wine production. Wine was sometimes mixed with water to dilute it, creating a beverage that was safer than untreated water but used less wine. Cider, made from apples, was produced in regions where apples grew well, and was consumed by people of various social classes. Perry, made from pears, was a similar beverage that was particularly popular in some regions. These fruit-based beverages provided safe alternatives to water and were less expensive than wine. Honey-based beverages like mead were produced in some regions and were considered luxurious drinks. Mead required access to honey, which was valuable and relatively scarce, making mead an occasional luxury for most people. It was more commonly consumed by wealthy households and monastic communities that kept bees for honey production. Milk, as discussed previously, was not commonly drunk in medieval times for reasons of spoilage and safety. However, milk-based drinks made by mixing milk with honey or spices might occasionally be consumed. Medieval feasts represented extraordinary departures from the normal diet and demonstrated the power and wealth of those who could afford them. Noble feasts could last several hours and featured multiple courses with elaborate dishes made from expensive ingredients. These events were not simply about eating, but about displaying power, generosity, and sophistication. The ability to provide abundant food to a large number of guests was a way for nobles to demonstrate their wealth and gain loyalty and prestige. Feast menus were carefully planned and often documented by medieval scribes, giving us detailed records of what the wealthy ate. These menus show that medieval nobles enjoyed extraordinary variety and elaborate preparation of foods. Multiple courses were served, often with different dishes within each course. One famous feast for the Duke of Burgundy included multiple meat courses featuring venison, boar, pheasant, and other game, along with elaborate sauces, vegetables, and complex desserts. Pies and tarts were important components of medieval feasts. These could contain meat, vegetables, or fruits depending on the season. Meat pies, particularly those containing venison or other game, were status foods that demonstrated access to hunted animals. The pastry itself was a luxury, as it required white flour and butter or fat. The complexity of making and baking pies demonstrated the skill of cooks and the resources available to prepare elaborate foods. Roasted meats were central to feast menus. Whole animals or large sections of animals were roasted and carved at table, creating a spectacular display. The skill of the carver, who had to cut meat with precision and serve it to guests in an organized manner, was a mark of status and training. Large birds like peacocks, swans, and geese were sometimes served whole with their feathers attached, creating visual spectacles. Sauces were extremely important components of medieval feasts, often made from expensive spices, fruits, and vinegars. Pepper sauces, fruit sauces made from grapes or apples, and complex sauces with multiple spices were created to complement meat dishes. The creation of elaborate sauces required expensive ingredients and skilled cooks, making them status foods. Subtleties were elaborate sugar sculptures and fantastical creations that appeared between courses at noble feasts. These were not intended to be eaten but to be admired as demonstrations of skill and wealth. Sugar was an extremely expensive spice, and the creation of large sugar structures was possible only for the wealthiest patrons. These creations often depicted castles, animals, or religious scenes and were meant to impress guests with their artistry and the resources used to create them. Dried fruits and nuts were served at the end of feasts as desserts. Figs, dates, raisins, and dried apricots were imported from the Mediterranean and Middle East. Almonds, walnuts, and other nuts were either grown locally or imported. These foods were mixed with spices and sometimes sugar to create confections that were served to guests. Religious feasts associated with Christian holidays were particularly important in medieval life. Christmas, Easter, and feast days of saints were occasions for feasting, when normal dietary restrictions might be relaxed. On these days, people of all social classes would consume meat and celebratory foods if they could afford them. The preparation for these religious feasts determined household expenditures and work schedules throughout the year. Monastic communities were significant consumers of food and were leaders in food production and preservation. Monks worked in the fields to grow their food, and the daily diet of monks was carefully regulated by monastic rules that governed their lives. The rule of Saint Benedict, which was followed by many monastic communities throughout medieval Europe, specified what foods monks could eat and how they should eat them. The rule of Saint Benedict required monks to eat meals in silence while listening to readings from religious texts. Meat was generally forbidden to monks except in cases of illness. This meant that monastic diets, while being regular and complete, lacked the meat that secular people of means consumed. However, the prohibition on meat did not extend to poultry, eggs, or fish, which were important sources of protein in monastic diets. Bread was the foundation of monastic diet, just as it was for the general population. Monasteries baked bread regularly and consumed it at most meals. The quality of bread might be higher than that consumed by peasants, as monasteries had better grain supplies and equipment. Vegetables grown in monastic gardens provided nutrition and variety. Many of the vegetables grown in medieval Europe were first cultivated and improved in monastic gardens by monks who had the knowledge and resources to do so. Cheese, as mentioned previously, was produced in large quantities by monastic communities and was an important source of protein and nutrition. The development of specific cheese varieties was often driven by monastic innovation, with monks experimenting with different milk sources, fermentation times, and techniques to create cheeses with distinctive flavors and preservation qualities. Fish was important in monastic diet because it was allowed on days of fasting and abstinence, which comprised nearly half of the church calendar. Monasteries often had fish ponds called stew ponds, where they raised freshwater fish like carp and pike. The management of these fish ponds was a sophisticated enterprise that provided consistent supplies of fish for monastic tables. Eggs were an important food in monastic diet, and were eaten on days when meat was forbidden. Monastic communities kept chickens, ducks, and geese, providing a regular supply of eggs. These eggs were sometimes used in cooking but were also eaten directly. The preservation of eggs through techniques like storing them in lime or salt allowed eggs to be kept for extended periods. Days of fasting in monastic communities sometimes allowed only bread and water, though this was typically reserved for particular penitential periods. During ordinary fasting days, monks ate vegetable-based foods, legumes, bread, and fish. The contrast between feast days in monastery, when additional foods were allowed, and fasting days was significant and gave monastic life its rhythm. Despite the restrictions on what monks could eat, monastic diets were often more balanced and regular than those of the general population. The monastic requirement for work in agriculture meant that monks were involved in improving food production and preservation. Many of the agricultural innovations of the medieval period were developed in monastic communities. The majority of medieval Europeans were peasants who worked in agriculture, and their diets were fundamentally constrained by their poverty and the agricultural calendar. Bread made from barley or rye formed the bulk of the peasant diet. In times of poor harvests, bread made from inferior grains, beans, or even tree bark might be the only food available. Legumes were the primary source of protein for most peasants. Peas, beans, and lentils could be grown in fields and dried for winter storage. Pea soup and bean soup were staple dishes that provided nutrition without the expense of meat. These soups were often made by boiling legumes with water and herbs. creating hearty dishes that provided calories and some protein. Vegetables from the peasant garden provided seasonal nutrition. Root vegetables like turnips and onions could be stored through winter. Cabbages and other leafy greens were eaten fresh in growing season, and sometimes dried or fermented for winter use. Wild vegetables and herbs were gathered from fields and forests to supplement cultivated vegetables. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants, available primarily on special occasions or when animals had to be slaughtered. A peasant who kept a pig might have access to some pork, but the animal would likely be fattened for autumn slaughter and the meat sold or bartered to pay obligations to the lord. Chicken eggs might be more accessible to those who kept chickens, but even these might be more valuable for sale than for consumption. Dairy products were limited for most peasants. Those with a goat or cow might produce some cheese or milk, but these animals were valuable for labor and breeding, making them too important to use solely for milk production. Some peasants might have access to limited amounts of milk in summer when animals were lactating. Bread and legume soup formed the basis of peasant diet, supplemented with vegetables and occasional eggs or small amounts of meat. The monotony of this diet and the insufficient quantity of food in many years meant that malnutrition was common among the poor. Archaeological evidence suggests that medieval peasants were often shorter and had more signs of nutritional stress than modern populations. Fish was accessible to peasants living near rivers or coastal regions, though fishing rights were often controlled by the local lord, and fishing might require payment or permission. In coastal areas, preserved fish might be more accessible than to inland peasants. The preservation of fish through salting made fish a trade commodity that could reach inland markets. Bread quality was sometimes improved by mixing wheat with barley or rye. The type of grain available depended on local agricultural conditions and the success of harvests. In poor harvest years, people were forced to mix inferior grains with available supplies. During times of severe famine, bark, acorns, roots, and grass seeds were sometimes mixed with grain to create bread that was barely nutritious, but provided some calories. The diet of medieval peasants was generally insufficient in calories and nutrients. The hard physical labor required for agricultural work meant that peasants needed adequate nutrition to function, but their poverty meant they often received less than they needed. Women and children likely received smaller portions than men, which meant that their nutritional situation was often dire.